to do it. Good morning and welcome, and I'm very sorry we're 8 minutes late, but we do appreciate this panel being with us this morning. We look forward to your testimony as we have this hearing on the effects of Middle East events on U.S. energy markets. We convened today's hearing to have a discussion on recent developments in the Middle East and North Africa and their effect on world energy markets. Violent protests and political uncertainty in Egypt 2 weeks ago caused a sudden spike in oil prices that over the past few days has gradually subsided. The price increase was driven by investor fears over the possible shutdown of the Suez Canal and Summit pipeline, which transport up to 3 million barrels of oil per day. These events provide a catalyst for deeper examination of the economic and geopolitical factors that contribute to the pricing of oil and its impact on the United States. Events in the Middle East also demonstrate a number of facts. One, oil is a globally traded commodity, the price of which is influenced by basic laws of supply and demand. Two, political events do play a major role on influencing the price of oil. And three, half the world's oil is produced in OPEC member states and Russia. Some of these nations are politically and economically unstable, and in a tightening market, unreliable sources of oil will prove increasingly detrimental to price stability and international security. It also certainly reinforces the issue of the importance of Canada and our relationship with Canada as it relates to energy. With these facts in mind, we should turn our attention to the current state of international energy markets. We have a booming demand in China, which greatly outpaces that of the OECD countries. We've seen in 2008 how OPEC's spare capacity can reach dangerously low levels during periods of high global demand. We have new frontiers of oil production ranging from the Arctic to enhanced recovery technologies here in the U.S. Additionally, we have restricted vast supplies here in North America by government action or, in many cases, government inaction. I should say we have restricted vast supplies due to government action or inaction. Now, how do all of these factors relate to domestic energy policy? For starters, there are numerous steps we can take to protect ourselves from price and supply shocks. The National Petroleum Council estimates we have upwards of 40 billion barrels of oil locked away in the eastern Gulf of Mexico, Atlantic and Pacific coast, on and offshore Alaska, that are currently off limits for production. These 40 billion barrels are double the proven reserves in the U.S. today. These resources could easily double our domestic production capacity and replace our imports from the Middle East. This is the quickest and most efficient way of reducing dependence on foreign sources and ensuring environmental safety. Any barrel we do not produce here in the U.S. or Canada will have to be produced in a remarkably less safe, less regulated, and more environmentally damaging manner in Nigeria, Venezuela, Angola, and other states where environmental quality is a depressingly low priority. Essentially, failing to produce domestic energy guarantees environmental harm elsewhere in the world. Events in Tunisia, Egypt, Jordan, Algeria, and Yemen show how uncertain and dangerous this world is. Furthermore, these developments show how the price of oil can bend to the will of protesters thousands of miles away from our shores. How we react and adapt to these inconvenient reality is a test of political leadership that will play a major role in the economic and national security of America. And that's why we are so appreciative of all of you being here, and we look forward to your testimony. And with that, I'll recognize the gentleman from Illinois for his opening statement. Thank you, Mr. John, and thank all of you for your testimony. Mr. Hofmeister, in your opening statement, you talked about the possibility of increasing demand from 7 to 10 million barrels a day, and I think you indicated without any public funds. Would you elaborate on that a little bit about what regions of the country do you think that's possible to do? Where would that happen? And tell us a little bit about that.
If you break down where the oil sits, and while I agree that the narrow definition of reserves as required by the Securities and Exchange Commission suggests the U.S. has only 2, maybe 3% of proven reserves, there are probable reserves, and there are resources in the ground not counted in that number. So we're looking at more than 1 trillion barrels of oil in the United States available that could be addressed from an exploration and production. But specifically, East Coast offshore, Eastern Gulf of Mexico, Western Gulf of Mexico, especially deep water. Off the West Coast, there are, billions of barrels. Off of the Alaska coast, Bristol Bay, Chukchi Sea, Beaufort Sea, the Bakken Formation, enhanced oil recovery from former or existing oil fields, and, most importantly, oil shale in the Piceance Basin of Colorado, which includes Wyoming and Utah. The combination of all of those over the period of a decade or more could take us way beyond 10 million barrels. But I realize some people are concerned about the sensitivities. So I've only suggested a target of 10 million at this stage.
Right.
When we get to 10, we could consider more.
But if the proper government policies were in place, do you think that 10 million could be reached relatively quickly?
If you consider the capital investment plans of not just the major oil companies, but also the major independents and the small oil companies, we're in the hundreds of billions of dollars per year, much of that targeted for outside the United States, because that's where they are welcomed.
Right.
That's where they are wanted. That's where they're creating jobs.
Right.
Redirecting those billions to the U.S. because we would in turn welcome them to create American jobs in America would be a reversal of where we've been over a number of decades.
Right. Well, as you well know, this administration has been totally focused on green energy projects, which are fine, and I know billions of dollars or millions of dollars in the stimulus fund went to green energy projects, but I think most of us agree that this is a long-term solution to our problem. And Mr. John, I know that a moratorium was put in place sometime last spring, and then the court ruled it was illegal, and then a new moratorium was put into place, lawsuits were filed, and then Mr. Salazar, I think, removed that moratorium. But in effect, there is a moratorium because no permits have been issued in the Gulf, have they? Or has it?
No, that is correct. There, to my knowledge, as of yesterday, there were no new drilling permits issued in the Gulf of Mexico. The moratorium was set in place May the 27th, and then, of course, there was a subsequent court battle, which obviously threw out the moratorium, and then I think just a week or 2 weeks later, the administration came up with another moratorium.
Right.
And that in itself, I think, Mr. Chairman, is very troubling. I like to believe, and maybe this is a little subjective, that the process at which this came down has been more harmful than the actual moratorium.
Well, let me ask you, hasn't the federal judge that's holding that case, hasn't he actually held the Obama administration in contempt of court?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
I read that yesterday or a couple of days ago in the paper that the judge is now holding this administration in contempt for violating his orders.
Well, it has certainly been in and out of the courts and decisions, and all of this time we have 30,000 people at the minimum waiting to go back to work in the Gulf of Mexico.
Well, Mr. Hoffmeister's suggestion, which I certainly agree with, he said would create about 3 million more jobs, certainly help make us less dependent, create all these jobs, as you said. Now, Dr. Bush, you talked about your Apollo Alliance, and you mentioned in here public transit rail projects. Are you talking about private expenditures there, or are you talking about government expenditures?
Well, government expenditures, but I think, there is a role for private-public partnerships, and sort of loan guarantees can help leverage.
Well, I think the problem that we have today about any more government expenditures is just the fact of the financial situation we're in. And the great thing about what Mr. Hoffmeister is talking about is that we're talking about private dollars here, and that's, in my view, the way we need to go right now. But my time has expired, so I'll recognize Mr. Rush for 5 minutes.